Hello everyone, my name is Daria. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome, so glad to have you here. Nice to see you. How's it going? I hope you're doing well. Today I have some recommendations for actual, literal beginners in the classics genre. No offense to any BuzzFeed or Bustle articles out there, but anyone who's recommending Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice, Oliver Twist to a beginner straight off the bat, they're lying to you. They're setting you up. I'm really sorry to tell you this. The classics that I have to recommend to you guys today, I definitely had some pretty concrete criteria as to what I was looking for. Number one, we're going to take a look at length. We want short, digestible books for you guys to get through. I'm also looking for prose that is fairly palatable, that is easier to understand, and I'm looking for entertainment value. I'm looking for books that will actually engage the reader and will keep their attention. And before we get started, I just want to give a few tips and recommendations to any beginners out there. But before we go any further, I want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes in a wide variety of creative topics. Anything from illustration, graphic design, interior design, marketing, videography, and so much more. Whether you're a beginner just starting to develop a new skill or a pro who wants to deep dive into a lifelong passion, Skillshare is the place for you. I recently took Kevin Siskar's productivity class and I was initially drawn in and became totally hooked because it's all about productivity in this modern digital age. Siskar teaches you how to prioritize what really needs to get done and how to follow through on your to-do list without constantly getting distracted by all the emails and notifications that are always popping up on your phone or laptop. One thing I really appreciated about the class was the fact that Siskar explains the scientific reasoning why we get so easily distracted and have a hard time focusing. Skillshare is a platform made entirely for learning, which means that there are no ads and they're constantly putting up new premium classes for you all to check out. And the first 1,000 people to click the link down below will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can explore your creativity. Number one, SparkNotes and any equivalent website is your friend, okay? There's no shame in that game. Because so often I feel like readers maybe get stuck in the fact that they don't even know what's going on, objectively. Who is saying and who is doing what, that they just kind of give up. Another thing I want to mention is that I know that people want to go straight into the big names. They want to read Austen, they want to read Dickens, and like I said, I would maybe hold off on reading Little Dorrit or Mansfield Park on your first time around. But a great alternative to that is to read the shorter stories and novels from these popular authors. For example, with Austen, maybe you can't get through Sense and Sensibility on your first go-around, but you can read Lady Susan, which is one of her much shorter works. So now that we've covered my criteria for this list, I've given you some pointers, let's go ahead and get into the list of the classics I recommend for all you beginners out there. The first book I want to recommend to you guys is E.M. Forster's A Room with a View. This is a very short, very entertaining, very humorous novel that I actually only recently read myself. This book follows a young woman named Lucy Honeychurch who goes on a tour of Italy with her very prickly and highbrow cousin Charlotte. While Lucy is staying in Italy, she encounters a lot of different characters from many different backgrounds, classes, and professions, and in particular, she meets a young, free-spirited, opinionated, and yet quiet boy named George Emerson. In the first part of the book, we are following George and Lucy as they fall in love in Italy, and in the second part of the book, she returns to her stuffy, regulated life in England, where she is betrothed to a man of a similar class to her. And then, miraculously, the Emersons make their way back into her life. I mentioned this before in my introduction to this book, but this is truly one of the most humorous and enjoyable books I've read in quite a long time. A lot of the characters in the book are representative of certain types of people. You have Lucy's cousin Charlotte, who draws very distinct lines between people based on social class and etiquette. And then you have a character like Mr. Emerson, who just completely disregards these lines based on social class and is very freewheeling and independent and talkative. The country was moving away from a lot of the stricter Victorian ideals that previously defined their nation, and they were becoming a lot more liberal. Factory workers, laborers, women, they were all making slow but significant strides to becoming part of the society, to gaining political power. But of course, there were also a lot of people who were trying to hold on to those strict class divides, to those very tight, stiff upper lip type of ideals. Like I said, a lot of the characters sort of represent these two sides of the political divide, and they'll sort of clash in very hilarious and very low stakes kinds of ways. The book is also obviously a love story between Lucy and George, and Getting to watch their love blossom was just very sweet. It was very pure. And Lucy is tasked with this dilemma of choosing between George and the guy that she's betrothed to back in England, Cecil. And at the same time, it is a choice, very much so, between like what she wants for her life. Like I mentioned before, a very short read, highly enjoyable, very funny, and I think the language is much more approachable than other classics. The next book that I want to recommend for beginners is Passing by Nella Larsen. In this book, we follow a woman named Claire, who is black but has been passing as white for a very long time now. She's married to a white man. Everybody in her life thinks that she's white, and Claire has actively made that decision to pass as white. And then one day she runs into a childhood friend named Irene, who is just as light-skinned and fair as she is. But Irene still claims her blackness, still goes about her life, exists in the world as a black woman. And when Irene comes back into Claire's life, that's when things start to sort of fall apart for her, both internally and externally. In this book, we're dealing with the questions of race. We're dealing with the questions of whether or not a person can pass and what privileges you get when you do pass as white, but also the ways in which that can be detrimental to your identity and who you are. Throughout the novel, Claire is constantly questioning whether she is betraying her race. She feels a lot of jealousy and anger towards Irene, but also a lot of admiration and, dare I say, attraction to her. Yes, there is a very interesting queer theory take on this book, which I personally absolutely love. Claire and Irene are in love. Go argue with the wall if you disagree. I really wanted to include this book on this list because it has all that criteria that I was looking for. It is short, it is fairly easy to read, it is intriguing, a total page turner. Another reason to pick up this book, in case you needed any more motivation than what I've already told you about it, is that there is a very highly anticipated adaptation coming to Netflix soon, which features Ruth Negga and Tessa Thompson, two incredible actresses. I cannot wait to see what they do with this material. I know that I definitely want to reread this before I watch the film and possibly do like an adaptation analysis. Just read this book. I promise you, whether you're a beginner to classics, whether you're intermediate level, expert, just read this book. The next book I'm going to recommend to you guys, I can hear the groaning and I can see you guys rolling your eyes already. It is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, okay? Hear me out on this one. Hear me out. Yes, I know this is one of those books that you were probably forced to read in school already, but please, please, if you were, just give it another shot. Another piece of criteria that I forgot to mention at the start of this video that I took into account when creating this list is that I wanted to include books that are already sort of part of our cultural lexicon. There have been countless films that were born from Shelley's work. My personal favorite is the Alvin and the Chipmunks version. Frankenstein is a monster that I think we are all very familiar with, and at the same time, I think we're also familiar with that same old line, Frankenstein is not actually the monster, he's the scientist. Like, I think we've all heard some form of that clarification, which is accurate. I think what's so fascinating about this novel is that it is a story within a story. We start off and Victor Frankenstein is writing letters about this grueling journey he has been on for so many years trying to track down this monster that he created. And then we go back to the time before he created the monster, the inception of it, the creation, and the ultimate downfall. This book just asks so many brilliant questions about who we are and what we're capable of as humans, and even if we can do something, whether or not we should, whether or not it is our place to play God, to create something, to try to reverse the natural order of life and death. I'm starting to think that I maybe should have mentioned this book at the end of this list because I think it's definitely a transitional read between beginner level status of reading classics and intermediate. There are a lot of denser passages in this book where Shelley will often go on to describe the setting around her, what the world looks like, nature. But those passages, while they may be hard to get through, they're also like so vital to the plot and to the beauty of this book because so often the external circumstances of the setting, what is going on in nature around these characters is exactly like a mirror of what is going on internally for them. One thing I love about this book is that we get to see a lot of the events play out in Victor Frankenstein's mind. We see the monster as this truly horrible thing, this blight on the world, and then we go into the monster's perspective and we see what he went through. And it's this total change in like who is the villain of the story. The idea of the unreliable narrator, the idea of having two characters witness and or experience the same event, and yet they see it in entirely different ways. Those are devices and themes that have always interested me in any of my fiction, and I really think it's because of this book and of what Mary Shelley did so brilliantly in Frankenstein. I think once you've read like all the other books that I've mentioned on this list and you feel ready to go on to read like Pride and Prejudice, Jane Eyre, to sort of push yourself up to the next level, this is definitely a book that you should try to go through that like transitional phase. The next book I want to recommend to you guys is actually more of a novella, or even a short story if you will, and it is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if there is an author that you really want to get into, just go for maybe some of their poetry, their shorter stories, their novellas, and in the case of Charles Dickens, this is definitely the work that I would recommend that you try. Ebenezer Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, these are a character and a story that everyone is already so familiar with. And that actually really works in your favor because you're going in with this great baseline, you already have a foundation, you know what the story is about, and so you can really dig into the language, the characterization, and just how funny and witty and clever Dickens is. I don't know if I need to really explain the story of A Christmas Carol, but I'll go ahead and do a short summary anyway. It follows Ebenezer Scrooge, who is a man who is tight with his purses. He's very old and grouchy and just really cruel, honestly. On Christmas Eve, he is visited by 3 ghosts. The ghosts of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmases yet to come. After all of these visits and what he sees, Scrooge becomes a very kind, empathetic, and compassionate person who helps others in this community. I think A Christmas Carol could be really beneficial for beginners because it reads like a fable. It reads like an allegory. A lot of the characters aren't very fleshed out or complex. All of them sort of represent certain types. Ebenezer Scrooge himself is just like outrageously cruel and it's just like this horrible miser. Likewise, the poor characters that Scrooge is so mean to, they are just like these paragons of innocence and purity and goodness, and they forgive Scrooge like immediately after all these horrible things that he's done to them, which isn't realistic, but that's not really what the story is about. A lot of people read it as like a Christian allegory, sort of showing that it's never too late to repent and to try to become a better person and help your fellow man. Dickens himself had his own agenda while writing the story, a far more political one. He wanted to show the British public that tended to ignore the plight of the poor just how dire it was, and he wanted to sort of make them more compassionate and sympathetic. The next book I want to recommend to all you beginners is Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. Once again, a very popular novel, a novel that has sort of gone beyond just its literary status. It is sort of like a staple of our culture, I believe. Now, this is widely regarded as like a children's book. I know there have been many like children's versions that have been sort of condensed and put out there and published. I honestly think that it only makes it like a better place to start for beginners. Because Alcott wrote this book with like younger girls and younger children in mind, it means that the prose is going to be far more accessible and easier to understand and get through. So for those of you who don't know, although I doubt there are very many of you, this book follows the 4 March sisters, Meg, Beth, Jo, and Amy. Their father is fighting in the Civil War, they are living alone with their mother, and they're really struggling financially. The girls are also just going through like very tumultuous times personally, every single one of them. Meg, the older sister, she sort of wants that more like luxurious lifestyle. She wants to go to the balls, she wants to go to the parties, she wants to have nicer dresses. Jo, the second oldest, who is like the main character of this book really, she is free-spirited, independent, she is fierce, she wants to be a writer more than anything in the world. She wants to make a living off of her writing, which at the time was not really possible at all for a woman. Beth is the very sweet but also very sickly third sister, and Amy is the youngest. She is kind of like the brat of the family, more so than Meg. She can be very snobbish, and I say that with the most love and care in the world. I absolutely adore Amy. I'm sure anyone who's watched a certain video of mine knows this. The story is about sisterhood, and it's also about the struggles of transitioning from childhood to adulthood. Jo in particular is always wanting to hold on to her childhood because that was the time when she was surrounded by her sisters, where they had no cares in the world, when they were playing games and writing and putting on plays and playing music and just always with one another. All they had was really each other. We see Meg grow up and deal with a lot of the financial troubles that she was already struck with in her youth. Now she's dealing with them as a mother and a wife. We have Beth, whose health continues to deteriorate, and she struggles with that, and it impacts the whole family, especially all the sisters. And then we see Amy, who is taken under the wing of the March sisters' very rich aunt, and how she's trying to bag a good match so that her whole family can sort of rise up out of poverty. I think this book is just very Cozy is the word that comes to mind. It's very sweet and very heartwarming. I think anyone who reads this book, they'll find one sister at least to relate to, and hopefully you can see yourself in every single one of the characters in some capacity. So many people who pick up this book become attached to these four girls. They become attached to the family, the story, the sort of extraordinary ordinariness of their lives. And honestly, I think that is what draws me and so many readers to this book, that a lot of the trials and tribulations these girls go through, they seem so minuscule and so unimportant, and yet for a young girl, they mean like the end of the world. Like there's one scene in which Jo has to cut off all her hair so that they can make some money, and even though Jo is not like very concerned with her looks, like it is a devastating thing for her. The next book I want to recommend is the gothic thriller Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This book, by virtue of being written in 1938, is going to have a lot more modern language, and honestly when I read it, I didn't even feel like I was reading a classic. As I mentioned before, I'm looking for page turners, and this book is definitely that. We are dealing with a mystery, with thriller, with suspense. It is going to keep you wanting more. It's going to keep you engaged. This book follows a unnamed main character who is working as a companion to an older rich woman, and while she's on a trip with her, she meets a widower named Maxim de Winter, and they end up falling in love and getting married. When Maxim takes our main character back to his estate, she sort of becomes haunted by the memory of his first wife, Rebecca. The estate called Manderley is run by a woman named Mrs. Danvers, who was Rebecca's sort of right-hand woman. She loved her so intensely and was so devoted to her, and still is so devoted to her, even in death. And as our main character stays at this house, she becomes increasingly paranoid, and she starts to question how exactly Rebecca died and whether or not her husband had anything to do with it. What I really love about this book is like the slow burning suspense. Nothing really outrageous ever happens, but the tension remains regardless. Just like the main character, we are completely oblivious to what is going on. We're questioning things at the same time she is. We're finding things out at the same time she is. We're trying to piece together this puzzle just like she is. We're really following her, and we know as much as she knows. This book definitely borrows from like the gothic tradition while also having hints of like more modern mystery and detective novels. It just kind of feels like a true crime case being unfolded right before your eyes. The next book I want to recommend to you guys is The Awakening by Kate Chopin. This book is set in the late 1800s, and it follows a woman named Edna who is married with a child, and she just feels very dissatisfied with her life. While on vacation, Edna meets and falls in love with a man named Robert, and they strike up a relationship. But then Robert leaves her, and Edna is just devastated and decides that she wants to go after him. She wants to live freely on her own. But she also knows that there are certain expectations of her as a wife and as a mother, so she returns to New Orleans with her family, but is just so depressed and dissatisfied with her life, more so than she ever was before. It is something that she can no longer hide or ignore. She starts retreating from society. She's no longer taking visitors. She is neglecting her son, and she just feels empty, really. And the book is very much sort of a critique of the expectations of women at the time. This book is just a really fascinating exploration of one woman's psyche, but also representative of the ways in which societal and gendered expectations can absolutely break down and harm the individual. The next book I want to recommend is Brave New World, a sci-fi dystopian novel by Aldous Huxley. Now, I know a lot of us have read 1984, a lot of people get recommended 1984, but I have to say that this is the dystopian novel that disturbs me more than 1984, more than any other dystopian novel I have ever read. The Brave New World in this novel, see what I did there, is based on the idea that everyone and everything belongs to everyone. So you have no individual autonomy, you can make no choices of your own, you have no personal relationships, no emotions, you only exist to be a part of this larger community and to contribute to that community. Children are made and created outside of the womb, and then they are sorted into certain classes, and those classes are then given certain jobs. So you really can dictate nothing about your life. And in this society, there is a drug that everyone takes called soma, which is meant to sort of relax you. It sort of like hits you with a bunch of dopamine, and you don't really care about anything that might have been bothering you. And this drug is taken a lot by everyone. So in this novel, we follow Bernard, who is part of that like sort of elite tier of society. But he just like doesn't really engage with anybody or the community at large, and this has become a concern. So he is told to go on a visit to this sort of like reservation or like island, sort of insulated community of people who live in the naturalistic way, i.e. people get to decide who they want to be, they get to have kids naturally, they fall in love, they make families. It's basically like how we live right now in 2021 in the real world. And when Bernard is there, he meets a man named John who was born in that naturalistic environment. And Bernard takes John back to the state, and that is where things start to unravel, both for John, for Bernard, and for the entire society, really. The dystopian genre is one that I think a lot of readers are familiar with. A lot of themes and topics that are discussed and brought up in this novel are going to feel pretty familiar. The novel poses a lot of really hard and very interesting questions, one of which is, in order to achieve an equitable society, are there certain like individual rights and individual joys and pleasures that people have to give up in order to achieve that goal? Is there a way to balance like social equity and community responsibility with the desires and the rights of individuals? The next book I want to recommend to you guys is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Again, this is another novel that I think people are pretty familiar with, even if you've never read the book itself. This book follows a young man named Dorian Gray, who is very beautiful and is admired everywhere that he goes. We follow Dorian as he strikes up relationships with two men, a painter named Basil and a very hedonistic man named Henry. Basil sees Dorian as his muse. He's very protective of Dorian, his beauty, his innocence, his purity. Henry, on the other hand, lives a very hedonistic lifestyle. He believes that life is all about consuming beauty, taking what you want, living life to the fullest, and not really caring who you hurt. And Dorian is very intrigued by that lifestyle and starts to see Henry as a kind of mentor and someone he should emulate. He takes on Henry's belief that you should only pursue beauty and pleasure. Those are the only things worth living for. And many of you know the next part of the story. Dorian decides to sell his soul in order to remain young and beautiful for all time. And a portrait that Basil made of Dorian will actually age for him. I love this book both for the story itself, but also for Wilde's preface and this question of what the purpose of art is. Is art meant to teach us something, or is it meant to please us, to be beautiful, to be enchanting and entertaining? The book ponders what beauty is, where it can be found in the world, and what lengths people will go to preserve it, and to even preserve their own vanity. It talks about how superfluous beauty and pleasure is, and how once you begin to pursue those, there can really be no stopping because it will never be enough. I think what makes this book also really great for beginners is that it's a fairly easy plot to follow, even though Oscar Wilde's writing is so gorgeous and it's going to keep you turning the page. It's just going to be very simple for you to digest what's going on and for you to really then appreciate like what Oscar Wilde is doing with his language. The next and final piece of work that I want to recommend to you all of you beginners, is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. Now the reason I'm really recommending these is because, once again, Sherlock Holmes. Everybody knows this guy. Even if you've never read any of the stories, maybe you watched the show, maybe you've seen an adaptation, maybe you just know about the guy because his name is dropped so often in conversation. Another reason I want to recommend this work is because it is a collection of short stories, and obviously they're going to be really easy to get through. You can read one of them, two of them, however many of them that you like, but they're going to be a really great way to practice consuming harder prose, tougher language. What's great about these stories is that they all tend to follow a similar format. They're told in the point of view of Dr. Watson, who is Sherlock's companion. And this is actually really great because we, the reader, get to be in the head of the everyman character, Watson. If we were in Sherlock's head, he would be going a mile a minute. There would be no time to explain anything. So it's much better to be in Watson's head and get to watch Sherlock through his eyes and see how Sherlock puts two and two together. Watson and Sherlock, they're both extremely quick-witted. They have a great rapport. It is just fascinating getting to watch them interact and have conversation. I think what's also great about these short stories is that they do give the reader a sense of accomplishment after finishing them. I feel like so often when you're just starting out reading classics, you can feel like a bit of a failure when you try to pick up Jane Eyre or any other brick of a book and you can barely get through it. It really does sort of hit you in the self-esteem and makes you not want to continue. So an instant instances like that, I would say reach for short stories like these so that you can keep the momentum going, you don't have to feel discouraged, and you can feel that sense of accomplishment that I think a lot of us like to feel when we're reading classics or reading anything really. So that is it for me today, you guys. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope I gave you some good recs. If you're a classics beginner, even if you've been reading a lot of classics, I hope that you found something on this list that is going to help you with your classics reading journey. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below. If you are a classics beginner, let me know if any of these recommendations are helpful, and if you've read them, what you thought of them yourself. If you want to find me or follow me anywhere else on social media, all those links will be down below. I love you all so very dearly, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye!